Unlike Caleb Williams in Chicago, the Atlanta Falcons set up Michael Penix Jr. for success.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And of course, if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka Sirius Black. And been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, been podcasting about them for over a decade, and I appreciate each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are talking about the Falcons' need for interior pressure and where will that actually come from? Will it come from players like Ruka Roro and Morgan Fox and David Onyemata, or will it come from Kaden Elliss and Jalen Walker? So more on that at the end of today's episode. But, you know, we'll start off today's episode sort of talking a little bit about the subject that sort of swept the NFL world by storm over the last couple of weeks, or last couple of days over the weekend. Which was the Caleb Williams drama, the fallout from, you know, Seth Wickersham of ESPN, who has a book coming out in September, you know, detailing various quarterbacks, you know, like he talks about Arch Manning's recruitment in there, but sort of, you know, in our NFL circles, we're talking all about, you know, some of the things he wrote about Caleb Williams, as well as, you know, some of the things that his father, you know, talked about in that. And, you know, if you missed it, you know, some of the excerpts that come out about Caleb Williams is that, you know, Caleb and his dad were tentative about going to Chicago, given their cursed history when it comes to quarterback development, where it's basically been 70 years since they've had a good quarterback. And it's like, you know, I think the quote was like, that's where quarterbacks go to die. And, you know, in that process, they were talking about some of the shortcomings of the Chicago Bears coaching staff, which has seemingly created a lot of discourse over the last couple of days amongst various NFL analysts and whatnot about, you know, how to watch film and teaching young quarterbacks to watch film. And that's kind of the element I want to focus on, because we can contrast that sort of dumpster fire of a situation in Chicago with the situation here in Atlanta, right? Because we've been talking a lot about this over the recent days and weeks on this podcast, as well as several years on this podcast. It's the nature versus nurture conversation, and that's at the core of this sort of Caleb Williams drama, if you want to call it. And that sort of conversation gets front and center when it comes to the quarterback position and developing those quarterbacks. And basically, like, the excerpts were the you know, the thing that's sort of caught on was, you know, Williams was essentially watching film alone with little to no guidance from the Bears coaching staff during his rookie season. And of course, I'm sure Locked On Bears is going to have more insight into that. But again, we'll take it from the Falcons angle, because we can kind of relate this and contrast this situation with what the Falcons did for Michael Penix in his rookie season, even if we didn't necessarily see Michael Penix as much as we saw Caleb Williams during his rookie season last year. Because you contrast the Falcon situation, they didn't throw Michael Penix to the Wolves. They set him up for success. We talked a lot last year after the draft when the Falcons selected, once the shock had worn off from the selection of Michael Penix. We talked about the sort of unique approach to the Falcons they're taking to the quarterback development, that if it works out, you know, other teams may be taking and adopting a similar approach when it comes to their developing quarterbacks. We're not quite there yet, but, you know, we're hopefully on that path. And we sort of joked about the 6 different quarterback coaches that the Falcons had in their building, not to mention the presence of a veteran quarterback like Kirk Cousins, where it certainly understands how to watch film and all those various things, and to sort of break that stuff down, that puts Michael Penix in an advantageous situation. But going back to those 6 different coaches in the room with Michael Penix and the other quarterbacks, you have offensive coordinator Zach Robinson, quarterbacks coach TJ Yates, offensive assistant and quarterbacks assistant quarterback coach DJ Williams, right? You got, you know, each one of those guys are all quarterbacks. Zach Robinson and TJ Yates played quarterback in the NFL, right? Have coached quarterbacks in the NFL, right? DJ Williams did not play quarterback in the NFL, but was a quarterback in college, son of an NFL legend in Doug Williams at the quarterback position. And so you feel like, okay, these are the three guys that, Kirk and not necessarily Heinicke, but for a while Heinicke and Michael Penix worked with on a day-to-day basis. And we kind of talked about it, how you have three different quarterbacks, three different coaches, each one of these guys is kind of gets the one-on-one time. And we talked about how Michael Penix was probably going to get a lot of work with DJ Williams. And, it's not a coincidence that DJ Williams this offseason was promoted to full-time quarterback coach, while TJ Yates is going to take a bigger part of the conversation with Zach Robinson with the game planning and whatnot. And then the other three coaches that have quarterback coaching experience that the Falcons have in the building that aren't necessarily working on a daily basis with, these quarterbacks, but are at least, are guys that can contribute in that regard. You got senior offensive assistant Ken Zampese, who coached Andy Dalton and Carson Palmer in terms of quarterbacks in Cincinnati for many, many years, as well as Taylor Heinicke in Washington. You have offensive assistant KJ Black, who played college quarterback and then worked somewhat with the Rams quarterbacks in the 2 years prior to him coming to Atlanta. You had former passing game coordinator or specialist Chandler Whitmer, who was another college quarterback. Now he's at Indiana, but he was in the building last year. He's the co-OC and quarterbacks coach at Indiana, and there's Indiana quarterback that's potentially going to be a high pick next year. So we'll see what work he does with those guys. And then, of course, at least initially for the first few months that Penix was in Atlanta, you had both Kirk Cousins and Taylor Heinicke in the room. So there was no concern about the Atlanta Falcons putting Michael Penix in the situation the Bears put Caleb Williams in, and sort of like, okay, Mike, go figure it out on your own, right? Where he's sitting alone in a room by himself, like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here, but I'm just going to fake it until I make it, right? And, does this sort of scenario, this environment that the Falcons fostered Michael Penix in year one guarantee that he's going to be a successful NFL quarterback? No, but it certainly doesn't hurt his chances of being a successful NFL quarterback. And so, it feels like the Falcons at least did the bare minimum, right? Like it didn't feel like the Bears, based off of these things, these excerpts coming from Seth Wickersham's book, that the Bears were doing the bare minimum. They weren't even able to do the bare minimum when it came to, just, hey, here's how you study film, and you study this on this day because we're going to install it the next day. You study this on the next day, because we install it that, all that sort of stuff. Caleb Williams didn't get that, right? And I was reading an article from Doug Farrar over at Athlon Sports. He was talking about how Caleb Williams, this is not unique to Caleb Williams, right? This has happened before because he had a conversation with Seth Wickersham over the weekend and wrote some of the quotes about that. And he was talking about how, Jared Goff in LA, when Sean McVay arrived there in 2017, that Jared Goff was in a similar situation his rookie year. That was a disaster with Jeff Fisher in 2016 with the Rams and whatnot, and how one of the quotes was that McVay specifically signed Dan Orlovsky, now with ESPN, to be the backup quarterback to basically teach Jared Goff how to watch film and basically had to teach Jared Goff what an overfront is, what an underfront is, like all those things that Jared Goff didn't get taught in the lead up to the NFL and whatnot. And then you go to Alex Smith, another player that had a similar situation in San Francisco when he was the number one overall pick, right? Where they basically asked him to figure it out on his own. And eventually Alex Smith did. It took some time. But then when Alex Smith got to Kansas City and they drafted Patrick Mahomes, Alex Smith went out of his way to basically say, hey, Patrick, this is how we watch film. This is how we break it down to help that guy get off on the good foot so that, he would break the cycle in terms of bad quarterback development and whatnot. And so, we don't often praise this coaching staff on this podcast, probably, or, not as much as people would like us to. But they absolutely deserve credit to not fall in the very obvious trap that the Bears fell into, right? They didn't basically take their young quarterback out into shark-infested waters and toss them overboard and like, we'll see you back on shore, and just, no life preserver, chum in the waters, all that sort of stuff. So, they deserve praise for that. I think we tend to go a little bit too often. I can only say so many positive things, right? We tend to go a little bit too often where we're like mission accomplished when it comes to Michael Penix based off of where he is right now. And it's like, let's pump the brakes a little bit on that, George, at this stage, right? Again, we're hoping, right? Not to mix my metaphors, but like we got to let the plane land first before we celebrate a little bit too much, like it's looking great right now. We're cruising at 40,000 feet. We're on Penix Air. We're just pumping away all that stuff, first class, all that stuff, right? But like, let's get the plane on the ground because, for being honest, they also had another plane, Kirko Air, and that one crashed and burned in a cornfield somewhere in the middle of nowhere. So it's like it's all good on Penix Air, but let's make sure this plane lands before we start celebrating too much and being like, we did it, guys. It's like, but yeah, I think they're putting Penix in a prime position. You didn't have a disaster of a scenario for Penix in year one. We'll see what the execution is in year two for Michael Penix and the success he has, but it does set him up mentally well to be successful, not only from a mental standpoint, but from a film room standpoint, and then hopefully that leads to success on the field. And of course, we know that's going to happen. Pump away, but we'll continue the nature versus nurture conversation and talking about how and why the environment matters. Because, in a lot of ways, NFL teams are billion-dollar lemonade stands. Like, not every team gets this right. And that's worthy of further discussion as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So say goodbye to sticky notes, scribbled plans on the fridge, and overlapping calendar invites. The Skylight Calendar is here to bring clarity to the chaos and help families stay organized without the stress. This sleek digital display syncs with existing calendars like Google, Apple, Outlook, and more. And it's going to make it simple to track all your appointments, practices, dinners, and reminders all in one easy-to-see place. And for me, if I don't put it in my calendar, there's a good chance I'm going to completely forget about it. And that becomes bad when you're trying to line up guests for a future podcast and you wind up flaking on them because you just forgot about it because you didn't put it in your calendar. So whether you're like me or you're just looking to get more organized to try to get the kids to the activities or trying to figure out a time when you can have your next date night, check out the Skylight Calendar. So right now, Skylight is offering our listeners $30 off their 15-inch calendars by going to skylightcal.com/NFL. Go to skylightcal.com/NFL for $30 off your 15-inch calendar. That is skylightcal.com, skylightcal.com/NFL. So this Caleb Williams conversation to me is so fascinating because it touches on so many things that I've talked about on this podcast over the years. And I'm just like, see, this is what I've been talking about, where we've been talking about the nature versus nurture conversation with quarterback development ever since the Falcons drafted Desmond Ridder in 2022 and has remained an ongoing conversation now through 2025 with Michael Penix Jr., right? We talked about how, that was relevant because, that Arthur Smith regime, when it came to Desmond Ridder, had no track record for successfully developing a young quarterback, right? And when it comes to Michael Penix, neither does Raheem Morris's staff, right? Ken Zampese is the only guy on this coaching staff that you can say successfully developed a young quarterback with his time in Cincinnati with Carson Palmer and Andy Dalton. And so when it comes to the development of a quarterback, so much of it is hindsight based, right? Rather than forward thinking. And it's just like, it's much more muddied and confused when you're in it, right? In the present, when you're looking ahead to the future. Now, when you're looking back at the past, if it worked or you didn't work. And I've often brought this up when we've talked about Matt Ryan and sort of, when we look back at Matt Ryan's career and we kind of mythologize, especially his early career, because we know it worked out in the end, that we sort of forget about the ups and downs that Matt Ryan experienced pretty consistently through his first, 2.5 years in the NFL. Like we sort of mythologize it in the sense of like, we know his first pass against the Detroit Lions was a touchdown pass. And then we know he won Offensive Rookie of the Year, and we kind of skip over all the things in between. Like, we know good things happen because the Falcons, won 10, 11 games or whatever. But, we always kind of skip, that it was much more of a roller coaster with Matt Ryan, especially in that rookie year, than we think. Like, I bring it up all the time on the podcast when talking about this, but like, people forget, like, yeah, we marvel at the first start and the first pass that Matt Ryan made, but people forget that second start where the Falcons went on the road to play the Bucs, who I think were the defending NFC South champions. And Matt Ryan started that game 0 for 9 and threw 2 picks in that game and finished that game, I think, with like completing less than 40% of his passes. And so there's a lot more ups and downs with that than you typically see. And, it's because, in a lot of part, it's, if you're a fan of a certain age, if you're in your 20s, like you don't remember Matt Ryan's early career. You were a child back then. Right. As far as you're concerned, like Matt Ryan's early success came by the same mechanism that allows Santa Claus to visit every house on a single night throughout the calendar year, which is magic. Right. But one of the things I thought was interesting when, going back to Doug Farrar's article talking about some of the things that he talked about with Seth Wickersham in this very subject of quarterback development and whatnot was a thing where he likened NFL teams to billion-dollar lemonade stands. And let me read you the quotes. So here's the quote from Seth Wickersham talking to Doug Farrar. He said, "Years ago, I was getting drinks with a longtime team president, and we were talking about NFL teams, the decision-making, how things were operating, how we think of NFL teams as these huge Fortune 500 companies, when in fact they're kind of mom and pop shops for the most part." And he said, referring to the team president, billion-dollar lemonade stands. And I was like, what? He said, they're billion-dollar lemonade stands because multi-million-dollar decisions are made with almost no thought sometimes. And I was stunned to hear that. But I thought about that a lot within the context of Caleb and Carl Williams, referring to Caleb's dad, and their process leading up to the draft, because Carl knew. He's an astute, sophisticated businessman. He knew that as good as his son is, that his success as a pro quarterback would largely be determined by who picked him. And we like to think that these things don't matter, that great quarterbacks can transcend everything. So again, I think that analogy of billion-dollar lemonade stands really meshes with some of the things I've said. But, we've talked about, again, that nature versus nurture. This is not unique to quarterbacks. It applies to all players. We've talked about that already with Jalen Walker. We're going to continue talking about that with James Pierce, right, moving forward. And these two specific pass rushers that we put all our hopes and dreams are going to finally solve the Falcons pass rush issue. But these are guys that are kind of predicated, in my opinion, to be in a very specific type of scheme in order to be successful. We're not going to have as much of that conversation with guys like Billy Bowman and Xavier Watts, because I think both of those guys can probably succeed in a multitude of schemes. But that's worrisome, at least with the pass rushers, because there's the possibility that if the Falcons don't get the right results this year or whenever, that this regime is not going to stick around for much longer, and there's no guarantee that a new regime is going to come in and have and be able to build upon what this current regime is building upon, right? We sit here and we look at Caleb Williams, and we know that Ben Johnson is now the head coach there, and of course he's incentivized to figure it out with Caleb Williams. There's a big reason why he was attracted to go to Chicago to work with Caleb Williams. But that's not necessarily always going to be the case, right? And you can argue that's specific to Caleb Williams because he's the number one pick and the quarterback and all that stuff. But you see all the time in the NFL, you contrast that situation with what happened in Washington last year with Dan Quinn and Adam Peters, right? Dan Quinn becoming the head coach, Adam Peters being the GM, and they basically cleaned house, particularly when it came to Washington's former first-round picks, right? Their three previous first-round picks that Adam Peters and Dan Quinn did not select were all cut or traded by the end of the calendar year after those guys got hired. And so that's a possibility. That's one end of the spectrum. There's the Ben Johnson end of I'm going to make it work with Caleb, and then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is the Adam Peters, Dan Quinn end of the spectrum, where we're going to clean house. And again, in a world where the Falcons are changing regimes, there's no guarantee that we're going to get the Ben Johnson end of the spectrum with whoever we hire, right? So I want to point that out. And so again, I think that billion-dollar lemonade stand analogy hits hard because it reminds me of something I said on the podcast way back in 2021 about Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith then when they first got the job, when I saw so many fans talking about this grand plan and this grand long-term vision that these guys had, and I don't know if that was the origin of the Let Terry Cook, meme or whatnot, but it was a similar sentiment. And I was like, there's no plan, guys, right? Every team, this team and every NFL team just makes it up as they go, right? And that to me is exactly the aspect of this billion-dollar lemonade stand analogy that you're using, where it's it's mom and pop shop running a Fortune 500 company. There's no long-term visioning. They're just kind of figuring it out as they go, because pretty much all these people that are putting these first-time GMs, these first-time head coaches have never done the job before, and they're all just figuring it out as they go. No different than anybody else who, is a first-time, for whatever job you do, the first time you do that thing, it's you're just kind of figuring it out, right? And so, we retroactively often like to see a meaning when it comes to these guys and look at their moves and say, oh, this was a genius and this was the plan all along. It's no, we only say that because it worked out. I remember doing that with Thomas Dimitroff way back in the day, that when the Falcons were competing during Matt Ryan's prime at the highest levels, it was Dimitroff had this brilliant plan where he was going to draft a quarterback and he was going to sign Michael Turner and he was going to build the team around the run game and the defense. And then Matt Ryan was going to be ready. And then he was going to lead us to the promised land. And, in 2012 and 15, 16, that era of the team, that sort of outlook made total sense. But in the decade since, I realized he too was making it all up as he went along, but it just worked, right? And so it was like, oh, this is all genius plan. And so that's one of the reasons for my pessimism that you often see on this podcast. Like, I don't have a lot of faith in people, right? And so that certainly colors my perception when it comes to things like this. But like, whether you think that perception is fair or not, it gets reaffirmed every year when I go down to Mobile to attend the Senior Bowl, and I see some of these prominent NFL decision makers out and about throughout the town over the course of that week. And I'm like, oh, that's just a dude. Like, that person may be a very knowledgeable dude when it comes to the game of football, but like, they're not they're not any more qualified than really any of us to run $1 billion corporation that is a professional sports team, right? And it's no different than you or I, us peasants that aren't running football teams, in our daily jobs where, you have coworkers like Mike and Doug and Stephanie, in whatever your chosen occupation is. And those people may be very knowledgeable in the thing that you do on a daily basis, but like, they're not necessarily the people that you would say, oh, promote these people to be the CEO of whatever the equivalent is of that $1 billion corporation in your chosen occupation. And so like we understandably put sports and the people and these teams that run these teams on a pedestal, because that's just the nature of sport and fandom and whatnot. But at the end of the day, it's just kind of worth noting that the people that are running these teams aren't any different than Mike and Doug and Stephanie are in our daily lives. And so I just want to thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I could talk about this all day. It's the beauty of doing 260 shows a year. I don't have to talk about it all day because I could talk about it tomorrow. And there'll be plenty of opportunities for me to talk about some of these things in the future. And I'm sure it'll come up again at some point. We'll be like, you remember that $1 billion lemonade stand analogy? That like, this is where that hits and whatnot. But, the beauty of this pod is, we talk about a lot of things in May that only really seemingly become prescient and applicable once we get to November. And you're like, oh, that thing that we were talking about 6 months ago, that applies. And, one of those things that we're going to be talking about today on May that is going to be very applicable once we get to the season is going to be the team's need for interior pressure. And we're going to break down exactly how the Falcons are going to generate that interior pressure and how that potentially can make or break the team's pass rush this upcoming season. So this conversation piggybacks on a conversation I had last week or 2 weeks ago. I guess we're coming up on 2 weeks. Yeah. With Derek Klassen of the Athletic Football Show. And that piggybacks on a conversation Derek had with his co-host, Robert Mays, on the Athletic Football Show 2 weeks ago, where they were talking about sort of speed versus power rushers. And, it came up again on the Locked On Falcons Discord over the link in description below if you want to join the conversation, where one listener, borderline listener, probably more accurate, but he hangs around the Discord and occasionally listens, is probably a more accurate way to describe it. But he was sort of comparing like the potential ceiling of guys like Pierce and Walker being, predominantly speed rushers, and saying like, oh, the best case scenario of how this works is similar to Alex Highsmith and TJ Watt, right? And that's the way that you want to, those are the two best predominantly speed rushers, that combination of bringing those guys off the edge. And one of the things that I pointed out to this person, and one of the things that Derek and Robert were talking about in that episode that they were talking about, and Derek is sort of touched upon when he came on this podcast, was if you're going to have that speed, you need to have that interior rush. And using the Steelers analogy, an example, I told this person where it's like, that works because the Steelers were able to get that interior push and pressure from guys like Cam Hayward and Stephon Tuitt and Keanu Benton and Javon Hargrave and Larry Ogunjobi over these last, 7-8 years that Watt has been there, and the last, 5 years that Highsmith has been there. And so, it's the idea that outside speed and interior power, if you want to call it that, but really any interior pressure, they need to complement each other, right? Because you have those speed rushers coming off the edge, pushing upfield, that forces the quarterback to step up in the pocket, and then he steps up into the waiting arms of those interior guys to get that sack, or vice versa. Those interior guys collapse the pocket, that pins the quarterback deep in the pocket, right? And so that's where the speed rushers can get around the edge and get him down on the ground. And so the question that Derek and Robert were talking about on their show, and we had Derek briefly touch upon on this show and that we're going to revisit again on today's episode is, do the Falcons have that right combination? We know that they have a lot of guys that bring speed off the edge between Jalen Walker and James Pearson, Leonard Floyd and Arnold Ebiketie, right? They have plenty of speed on the outside, but do they have enough interior push, right? Between Morgan Fox and David Onyemata and Ruka Roro and Kentavious Street and Zach Harrison, Brandon Dorlus, Taquan Graham, all that stuff, and when you look at this group of interior guys, Fox and Onyemata are the most proven guys. And, hopefully they will benefit from playing in this attacking front, particularly a guy like Onyemata. The question with him is he past his prime? He's currently 32, going to turn 33 in November, coming off a down year. There's been speculation I've seen from folks over the last, since the draft. Is he going to be a post-June 1 cut? I'm skeptical of that at this stage in time, just because, but we've been talking about David Onyemata really since January being a potential cut, and especially since March. It was like a little surprised to see the Falcons retain him as opposed to someone like Grady Jarrett, this offseason. But like at this stage, like the Falcons don't really have other proven options, because like even when you look at Morgan Fox, who is a proven pass rusher, he's been primarily a situational pass rusher rather than an every down player over the course of his career, because he's not a great run defender in that regard. And it's a similar conversation with Morgan Fox that we're having with James Pearson and Jalen Walker, where it's just like, are you going to be able to get into some obvious passing situations that are going to allow those guys to maximize their skill set and truly unleash them as pass rushers? Or, our team's going to run the football down your throat. And similar to the conversation we had last year about down and distance, where the Falcons really struggled to get into those third and obvious situations where their guys could pin their ears back and get after the quarterback. But that will be an ongoing conversation all summer long here on the podcast. But, besides these proven options, the Falcons are really high and optimistic that these young guys like Ruka Roro and Brandon Dorlus that they selected last year, Zach Harrison that they selected 2 years ago, the arrow was pointing up for these guys. And the question is, are these guys going to be able to provide that interior pressure that the team is going to need, especially with this scheme, this attacking scheme that Jeff Ulbrich is bringing in, that wide nine scheme that we expect the Falcons to major in this upcoming season, like the Jets did the last 4 years under Jeff Ulbrich as their defense coordinator. But the thing that's lacking here in Atlanta relative to what the Jets had over the last 4 years was Quinnen Williams, right? That I went and crunched the numbers, and across the 4 years that Quinnen was in New York playing under Ulbrich, every year he averaged about 700 snaps per season, and across each season he averaged about 700 snaps, 7.5 sacks, and about 52 pressures per year. And then I compared that to the Steelers interior guys that I mentioned earlier, Stephon Tuitt, Cam Hayward, Javon Hargrave, Larry Ogunjobi, and Keanu Benton, right, that played with TJ Watt as early as 2017 and been playing with him and Alex Highsmith up to this past year, and looking at their averages per 700 snaps across that period of time. And Tuitt and Hayward were averaging roughly 7 sacks, 51 pressures for Tuitt, 49 pressures for Hayward, 5.5 sacks across 700 snaps for Javon Hargrave during his days in Pittsburgh, 40 pressures. Larry Ogunjobi was 2 sacks and 29 pressures. Keanu Benton was 1 sack and 27 pressures. And then you compare that to who the Falcons have coming off their most recent year. Grady Jarrett was the only guy up front that hit over 700 snaps, and he hit 2.5 sacks and 34 pressures. So not quite, the Tuitt, Hayward, Hargrave level, but above Larry Ogunjobi in that regard. And then you look at David Onyemata, who had 567 snaps, 3 sacks, but only 19 pressures. Morgan Fox coming off a career high in terms of 619 snaps last year with the Chargers, 3.5 sacks, 32 pressures. And so it's hard to look at this group of guys, this current group of guys, and say there's somebody that's on the Quinnen, Tuitt, Hayward, Hargrave level right now on the team. And so for me, I don't know if the Falcons can rely solely on their D tackles to provide that interior pressure that we need in order to make this type of rush and scheme work with all the speed that the Falcons are bringing off the edge. And that's why, again, I'm going to reiterate, I think the Falcons are going to have to rely heavily on Kaden Elliss and or Jalen Walker as those interior rushers, lining up with those stand-up off-ball linebackers in the A and B gaps and bringing those simulated pressures where those guys are rushing and other guys are dropping and whatnot. And we saw that when you look at Kaden Elliss last year, obviously playing a lot more than 700 snaps, but not getting nearly as many opportunities to rush a quarterback, 400 some odd opportunities that these guys are often getting playing 700 snaps, only getting like 150 or so opportunities. And Kaden Elliss had 5 sacks and 43 pressures, which is much more in line with Javon Hargrave's sort of career averages. And it's the idea now that you add Jalen Walker to the mix, as I discussed last week on the podcast, 2 K Nellises are better than 1, right? And so this is why you're going to continue to hear me on this podcast that I haven't quite seen other people talking about elsewhere, because everybody's talking about how the Falcons are saying, hey, we're going to start Jalen Walker at edge. And I'm just like, okay, you can start him at edge, but like where this team really needs to find ways to maximize Jalen Walker is going to be alongside Kaden Elliss in that similar role on these sim pressures, lining up in the A and B gap, if you ask me, right? And again, I think there's 2 reasons for that, right? I just think right now at this stage in his development, in his career, Jalen Walker is a better off-ball rusher than he is as an edge rusher. And I also think because of what we're talking about, the Falcons have a much more pressing need for Jalen Walker's presence on the interior than they need at edge, because they already have guys like Pierce and Floyd and Ebiketie that I would argue at this stage, and maybe I'm wrong in this assessment, but I think are probably better as far as natural edge rushers at this point than what Jalen Walker is going to bring. I think Jalen Walker at best is probably going to be your 4th or 5th best edge rusher going into this season, when he can theoretically, if he can put up production similar to Kaden Elliss, could be your number 1 or number 2 interior rusher in terms of that production. So that's my vision of it. I'm not expecting any one of these guys, Cam Hayward or Quentin Williams is not walking through that door at this point in time. Like maybe Larry Ogunjobi, maybe Keanu Benton is walking through that door. But, if even if you're getting that, you still got to finesse it, right? And again, I think Elliss and Walker as those interior rushers are going to be your best bet to finesse it. And that combination alongside whatever you get from Morgan Fox and David Onyemata and Rook and Dorless and Harrison and Street and Graham, et cetera, is going to get you to the point where, to me, you can get to a acceptable level in terms of that interior pressure to make that speed work on the outside. Because just look at the tackles that you're going to face in the first 6 games of the season, right? Now that we know the schedule, guys, right? You got Tristan Wirfs and Christian Darrisaw and Brian O'Neill and Laramie Tunsil and Dion Dawkins and Trent Williams. Those are just the first 6 games that you're going to face some of the premier tackles in the NFL. And then you look at the same guards and centers that play on those teams. And again, they're not chopped liver or anything like that, but it's like, that's a much more exploitable matchup for the current Falcons personnel. That's where if you're going to exploit these offensive lines, it's going to be on the interior. And if we're going to expose these weaknesses out the gates early in the season in September and October, like, I don't know if I could trust the current crop of Falcons defensive tackles to be able to do that on a consistent basis like the Falcons are going to need to. So, we'll see what happens with that. It all part of, like, I get a little nervous when I hear Jeff Ulbrich talking about, like, we're not going to scheme up pressure. We're just going to rely on 4-man pressures. And I don't remember the exact quote he had. And I understand it from a certain extent when you're saying, like, we don't want to necessarily rely on having to bring 5, 6, and 7-man in order to get pressure, because I get that. Because you saw that last year with the Jets, where, the Jets were like top 10 in the NFL last year in terms of bringing 5 and 6. And, their defense had a major drop off after many years of basically being able to rely on just 4. And I can understand why Jeff Ulbrich looks at that and says that was a major contributing factor to our downfall, because we couldn't trust 4 guys to get home. And that led to more breakdowns in the secondary and all that stuff. But at the same time, like, I get why he says that, if that's what he means when he says that. But if he's saying that, meaning that we're not going to run simulated pressures and whatnot, like the Falcons last year were tied for first place in the most usage of simulated pressures in the league, along with the Miami Dolphins, according to Cody Alexander, who of matchquarters.com. And I'm like, if this team is not top 5 in simulated pressures again this year, then, for me, I think this D is going to be DOA. So we'll see on that front, but we'll leave it there. I'm sure that will be an ongoing conversation here on the podcast all summer long, but our ongoing conversation about James Pierce and what he's going to bring to the table may continue tomorrow, assuming there's no other major breaking news that we have to cover for the Falcons. And so make sure you continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out by subscribing or following free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get that James Pierce breakdown, as well as check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast, where you can get the scoop on, I'm sure Joe and Kyle are, giving their thoughts on the whole Caleb Williams fallout and whatnot, and sort of how that affects team building and who are the people that are, most capable of, developing these young quarterbacks and all those various things. So, go check it out. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.